They called her Trash Girl. Every night, she mopped the polished floors of the wealthy office tower while the employees laughed at her old uniform. To them, she was invisible, nothing more than background noise. They mocked her, tossed papers at her feet, and treated her like dirt. But what they didn't know was that the quiet janitor they humiliated every day once wore a very different uniform. She had been a decorated military officer, a woman of honor and strength, and soon those who laughed would discover her hidden past in the most unexpected way. After a long night of work, she returned to her small apartment. The walls were dull and peeling, the air heavy with the smell of old paint and silence. She closed the door softly behind her, as if even the world outside didn't care to notice her coming home. Dropping her cleaning gloves on the table, she sank onto the edge of her narrow bed. For anyone else, it would have looked like just another tired janitor ending another long shift. But inside her chest, memories pressed against her like shadows she couldn't escape. On the floor beside her sat a plain cardboard box, worn at the corners. Most days, she ignored it, keeping it tucked away, hidden from sight. But tonight, after hearing the cruel laughter of the executives, her eyes drifted toward it. Slowly, with careful hands, she pulled it closer. The box creaked open, and inside, beneath folded papers and a faded flag, lay a photograph. She lifted it out with trembling fingers. It showed her, years younger, standing tall in a crisp military uniform. Her shoulders were squared, her chest heavy with medals that glimmered with honor. In the picture, her eyes burned with confidence, determination, and pride. She had been more than a janitor once. She had been a leader, a protector, a soldier who carried the weight of responsibility on her back. Her throat tightened as memories surged. The laughter of her fellow soldiers around a campfire, the sound of boots on rough dirt, the deafening crack of gunfire in the distance, and then the moment everything changed. A mission gone wrong, a decision she replayed over and over in her mind. She had survived, but not all of her team had. The image of faces she could never forget haunted her every time she closed her eyes. Her hand clenched the photo as tears welled in her eyes, but she forced them back. She had promised herself she would not cry again. Not for the past, not for the guilt, not for the pain that never left her. That night had taken more than comrades. It had taken her will to stay in the army. It had taken her identity. And so she walked away from the life of honor and duty, choosing instead to disappear into silence. Silence, she had learned, was easier than explaining, easier than carrying the questions, the pity, or the blame. So she found work that nobody respected, work that kept her invisible. She cleaned floors in tall buildings where no one ever asked about her past. To them she was just the janitor, just another shadow in the corner. She let out a bitter laugh, one without joy, as she whispered to the empty room. Once I led soldiers into battle. Now I clean floors no one even sees. Her voice cracked, but her gaze stayed steady on the photograph. She pressed it gently against her chest, feeling the weight of the medals she no longer wore. Her body sagged with exhaustion, but her eyes were sharp, filled with a resilience no insult could erase. Silence became my shield, she murmured. But silence doesn't mean weakness. She closed the box and pushed it back under the bed, hiding it once again from the world. But this time, something felt different. The cruel words of the executives still echoed in her ears. Trash girl, nothing but a janitor. They thought they had the power to define her. But deep inside, she knew the truth. They didn't know her past. They didn't know what she was capable of. For years, she had chosen not to fight. Not because she couldn't, but because she didn't want to. Peace had been her choice. But sometimes, peace comes at the cost of being underestimated. Sometimes, Silence allows arrogance to grow too bold. She sat quietly, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, her mind steady now. She was no longer drowning in guilt. The pain of her past was still there. But tonight something stirred, a reminder that the strength she once carried never really left. It had only been buried, waiting. Outside, the city lights blinked through her small window, their glow brushing across her tired face. She looked at her reflection in the glass, the plain uniform she wore to scrub offices, the lines of fatigue carved into her skin. To the world, she was no one, but in her eyes, she saw the soldier still alive, the leader still breathing beneath the silence. Her lips curved into a faint, determined smile, not one of pride, but of resolve. Let them laugh. Let them throw their words like stones. They didn't know the truth, and when the moment came, when they pushed too far, they would see the strength they mocked. She rose from the bed, washed her hands, and prepared for another day of invisible work. But as she turned off the light, one thought stayed with her. They had no idea who they were humiliating. They had no idea the fire they were about to awaken. And with that quiet truth, her story began to shift, leading toward the night when the line would be crossed, and silence would no longer protect the arrogant. That night was coming, and when it did, the janitor they called Trash Girl would show them who she truly was. The night was almost over. The office building had grown quiet, the kind of silence that settles after a party when only the echoes of music linger in the air. She was moving through the hallway with her mop, steady and calm, the same way she always did. For her, this was routine, another night of cleaning up the mess left behind by people who never noticed her. But tonight, the silence broke with loud voices and footsteps. A group of executives, still buzzing from alcohol and arrogance, stumbled out of the conference room, their laughter bouncing off the glass walls. They saw her immediately. To them, she was the easiest target, standing alone with her mop and bucket, wearing a uniform they thought was beneath them. One of them smirked, his tie loose around his neck, his glass still half full. "Look who's here," he said, pointing at her. "Trash Girl, hard at work." The others laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. She kept her head down, pushing the mop forward, ignoring them the way she always tried to. She had learned to be invisible, to let the insults roll past her without reaction. But they weren't content with just words tonight. Another man stepped forward, holding a cup of coffee. With a flick of his wrist, he spilled it across the freshly cleaned floor. The dark liquid spread quickly over the tiles. "Oops," he said with a mocking grin. "Better get that cleaned up, janitor. That's what you're here for, isn't it?" The group roared with laughter, enjoying the small cruelty as if it were a game. She paused, gripping the handle of her mop tighter. Inside, she felt a flicker of the same old anger she always buried deep down. But she forced her face to stay calm. She dipped the mop back into the bucket and began to clean the mess, without a word. Her silence seemed to irritate them. They wanted a reaction. They wanted to see her flinch. One of the younger executives stepped closer, his breath heavy with alcohol. He nudged the mop with his polished shoe, pushing it roughly out of her hands. "Don't ignore us," he said. "You're nothing but a janitor. Know your place." The others clapped and laughed like a pack of hyenas circling prey. They thought she was powerless. They thought she would bow her head, pick up the mop, and keep scrubbing like always. For a long second she simply stood there, her eyes on the floor, her breath steady. But inside, something was shifting. She slowly lifted her gaze, her eyes locking onto his with a calmness that was sharper than anger. Her voice was quiet, steady, but it cut through their laughter like a blade. "Careful," she said. "You don't know my place." The words hung in the air. The hallway grew still, the drunken chuckles fading into uneasy silence. They weren't used to hearing her speak like that. They weren't used to hearing her speak at all. One of them scoffed, trying to shake off the sudden tension. "Oh, and what's that supposed to mean?" he said, puffing out his chest as if he could intimidate her. But she didn't flinch. She didn't explain. Her eyes stayed cold, steady, unshaken. The silence between them grew heavier, and for the first time, they hesitated. She turned slowly, reaching down to take hold of the mop again, her grip firm, her posture controlled. Inside, her thoughts burned. Every insult, every laugh, every time she had swallowed her pride in this building, pressed down on her. But tonight was different. Tonight, their arrogance had crossed a line. The coffee, the laughter, the shove of her mop. It wasn't just disrespect anymore. It was provocation, and she knew, deep down, that her silence was no longer enough. The executives didn't see it yet, but the balance in the hallway had shifted. Their arrogance had awakened something they couldn't understand. The woman they mocked as trash girl wasn't just a janitor. She wasn't weak. She wasn't powerless. She was holding back a strength they could never imagine. She took one step forward, calm and deliberate, and the men instinctively leaned back. They laughed again, but this time the sound wavered, uncertain. They didn't know why the air felt different, why their jokes no longer felt so safe. They had no idea that behind her silence was a history of battles, training, and discipline that none of them could match. She looked at them one last time, her voice low but firm. "You've had your fun. Now walk away." But they didn't walk away. They smirked and muttered, still convinced of their power. What they didn't realize was that their taunting had already lit the fuse. And soon, the quiet janitor they thought they controlled would show them a side of herself they were never prepared to see. The hallway seemed to stretch into silence again as she turned back to her work. But her patience was done. Her shield of silence cracked. The moment they pressed further, they would learn the truth, and that truth was coming faster than they could imagine. The hallway had grown darker as the group of executives pushed her further back, their voices bouncing off the walls, their laughter sharp and cruel. They thought they had her cornered, trapped near the supply closet with nothing but a mop and a bucket at her side. The smell of spilled alcohol and coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the heat of arrogance that filled the space. She stood still, her face calm, but inside she felt something shift. Her patience, stretched thin by years of mockery, finally snapped. One of them, bolder than the rest, stepped forward. His smile was twisted with drunken confidence as he placed a hand on her shoulder and shoved her back against the wall. The sound of the impact echoed through the hallway. The others laughed, clapping and cheering as if they had just scored a victory. To them, it was all just entertainment. But in that single instant, her body moved before her mind had even finished deciding. Her hand shot up with speed none of them expected. She twisted his wrist in one clean motion, forcing his arm behind his back. His smirk vanished, replaced with a cry of shock and pain as she pivoted and slammed him against the wall. The laughter around them died instantly, replaced with stunned silence. The entire group froze, their eyes wide, their arrogance draining away in the face of something they had never seen before. Her grip was strong but controlled. Every move was deliberate, every motion precise. It wasn't anger that guided her. It was instinct, discipline, and years of training that her enemies had no idea existed. She leaned close to the man she held pinned, her voice steady and cold. "You thought I was weak? I spent 10 years protecting this country." Her words cut through the silence like steel, echoing in the stunned ears of the men who just seconds ago thought they had power over her. The man struggled, but it was useless. Her control was effortless, her body steady and immovable. She released him only when she chose to, letting him stumble back into his group, clutching his arm with wide eyes. The others stared at her, their smug grins gone, their confidence shattered. They didn't know what to do. For the first time, they saw not a janitor, but something else entirely. She straightened her shoulders, her eyes sweeping across each of their faces. Fear flickered in their expressions. None of them dared to step forward now. The silence was heavy, pressing down on them, making the air feel thick and unsteady. Slowly she took one step forward, her voice calm and even. "Now, who looks small?" The words hung in the hallway, sharp and undeniable. Not one of them laughed. Not one of them dared to speak. They had mocked her uniform, her job, her quiet nature, believing she was powerless. But in one swift movement, she had torn their illusions apart. Inside she felt no joy, no triumph, only control. She had not acted out of rage, but out of necessity. For years, she had chosen peace, swallowing every insult, every cruel joke. But tonight, their arrogance had crossed the line, and she had been forced to remind them of a truth they never knew. The men shifted uneasily, exchanging nervous glances, their drunken boldness replaced with something colder. Fear. They saw now that she wasn't the fragile, invisible woman they believed she was. She was something else, calm, disciplined, dangerous when provoked. The tension in the hallway was thick enough to choke. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to strike again. Her silence, her steady gaze, and the memory of how quickly she had brought one of them down were enough to keep them frozen in place. They had wanted to humiliate her, but instead they stood exposed, their arrogance stripped bare. She picked up her mop again, her hands steady, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't look rushed. She didn't look rattled. Her calmness only made their fear grow. She had proven that she was not who they thought she was. And now, every second they spent in that hallway reminded them of their mistake. The man she had pinned rubbed his wrist, his face pale, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. He knew if he pushed further, it would not end well. The others avoided her eyes, their shoulders tense, their laughter dead in their throats. She turned back toward them one last time, her voice low, carrying the weight of unshaken strength. "Walk away while you still can." The men hesitated, pride and fear battling inside them. They had always been the ones in control, the ones who laughed at others without consequence. But now, standing before the woman they had mocked, their power felt hollow. They realized too late that their game was over, and they were not the ones winning. She stood tall, her posture sharp, her face calm, but inside she knew something had changed. The balance of power had shifted, the truth of who she was had begun to surface, and the night was far from over. Their humiliation had only just begun, and the moment of karma was already building, waiting to strike. This was no longer just a janitor's silence against their insults. This was the moment they awakened the soldier she had hidden away, and soon their arrogance would collapse under the weight of the truth they could no longer ignore. The lobby of the building gleamed under bright white lights. The polished floors reflected every movement, every shadow, every drop of spilled coffee still smeared across the tiles. Security cameras in the corners captured everything in sharp detail, silent witnesses to the chaos that was about to unfold. She stood tall at the center, her plain uniform looking ordinary, yet her presence commanding the entire space. The group of executives circled clumsily, their drunken confidence fading into panic as they realized they were no longer in control. One of them lunged forward, trying to shove her out of the way, but she moved faster than his eyes could follow. With a single step, she shifted her weight, gripped his wrist, and twisted. He let out a cry as his body bent against its own strength. Stumbling before she released him, he fell to the ground, clutching his arm, staring up at her in disbelief. The others froze for a moment, unsure if they should attack or retreat. Another, louder than the rest, tried to mask his fear with bravado. "You think you can fight us? You're just a janitor," he shouted, but his words lacked conviction. He stepped forward anyway, swinging at her wildly. She didn't flinch. She sidestepped. With calm precision, hooked her foot behind his leg and sent him tumbling hard to the floor. His glass slipped from his hand, shattering into pieces. He groaned, humiliated, sprawled on the shiny lobby tiles. The rest of the group backed up, their arrogance collapsing with every second. Their polished shoes squeaked nervously as they shifted, looking around as if someone might save them from the woman they once mocked. But there was no escape. They had awakened something they didn't understand, and now they were trapped under the weight of her strength. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every movement she made was calm, steady, controlled. She was not seeking revenge. She was not trying to hurt them. She was teaching them a lesson that would burn deeper than any wound. Her silence carried more power than their shouts ever could. One of the men slipped on the coffee they had spilled earlier. He landed flat on his back, his suit soaked, his dignity shattered. Another tried to run past her, but she blocked his path effortlessly, forcing him to stumble backward. His voice cracked as he pleaded, "Please, just stop." The others looked at him in shock. These were men who strutted through the office every day as if they owned the world, and now they begged in fear like children caught in a storm. She finally spoke, her voice sharp and unshakable, echoing through the lobby. "Respect is earned, not worn in a suit." The words struck them harder than any blow. They lowered their eyes, ashamed, but unable to escape the truth that hung heavy between them. The glass doors at the far end of the lobby opened, and the building's night security guards stepped inside. Their radios crackled as they looked around at the scene unfolding. What they saw was shocking. The executives, usually loud and commanding, were stumbling, soaked, and humiliated, while the janitor stood firm, calm, and unshaken in the middle of it all. The guards didn't need an explanation. The cameras had already recorded everything. Every insult, every shove, every attempt at humiliation was now captured on video for anyone to see. The men who thought they were untouchable were now exposed under the harsh, unforgiving lights of the lobby. Their power had crumbled in front of the very people they considered beneath them. One of them tried to straighten his suit, trying to regain even a shred of dignity. But his voice shook when he spoke. This doesn't change anything." But the words rang hollow. Even he didn't believe them. His eyes darted toward the guards, toward the cameras, toward anyone who might erase what had just happened. But there was no escape. She took one final step forward, her eyes sweeping across the group of men who had mocked her for so long. Her face was calm, her breathing steady, her presence unshakable. "Remember this night before you laugh at someone again," she said softly. The quiet authority in her tone silenced every last sound in the lobby. None of them dared to answer. None of them dared to meet her eyes. She didn't stay for their excuses or their shame. She picked up her mop, steady and deliberate, as if nothing had happened, and began walking toward the doors. The security guards stepped aside, giving her the space she deserved. For the first time, she wasn't invisible. For the first time, the people around her saw her for who she really was. She left the lobby behind, her footsteps echoing across the polished floor. Behind her, the executives stood broken, their arrogance shattered, their humiliation complete. Ahead of her, the quiet night waited, carrying her into the dawn of something new. She had not sought revenge, only justice. She had not raised her voice, but her actions had spoken louder than their cruelty ever could. And as she walked away with dignity, she knew the lesson would stay with them forever. They would never forget the night they called her Trash Girl, only to discover that she was stronger than they had ever imagined. And with the balance restored, her story moved toward its final chapter, where silence would no longer mean invisibility, but strength. The resolution was waiting, and with every step, she walked closer to it. The night had finally surrendered to morning. As she stepped out of the tall glass doors of the office building, the world outside was quiet, washed in the pale colors of dawn. The sky glowed with soft streaks of orange and pink, the kind of fragile beauty most people overlook in their rush to start the day. She walked slowly, her plain janitor's uniform still clinging to her frame, but there was nothing ordinary about the way she carried herself anymore. Every step was steady, purposeful, and calm. The heaviness of the night's confrontation had lifted, leaving behind a silence that felt different now. Not the silence of hiding, but the silence of peace. She breathed in the cool morning air, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel suffocating. It felt freeing. The pain of her past, the weight of being underestimated, the sting of every cruel word, none of it defined her anymore. She hadn't fought back with anger or hatred. She hadn't raised her voice. She had simply revealed who she was, and that was enough. Behind her, the building loomed tall and gleaming, but its shine no longer intimidated her. She had faced its brightest lights and its darkest corners, and she had walked out with her head high. Somewhere inside, the security cameras still held the truth. The executives who mocked her, who called her names, who thought she was beneath them, would wake up to find their reputations cracking under the weight of what they had done. By the next day, whispers would spread through every hallway. People would point, not at her, but at them, the once arrogant men who had been brought down by their own cruelty. She did not need to see their shame to know it was coming. She could already imagine the way they would avoid eye contact in meetings, the way their confident voices would falter, the way others would laugh behind their backs. That was not her victory to celebrate. It was their consequence to bear. All she had needed was to stand her ground, and that was enough. As she walked farther down the street, the city slowly stirred awake. Delivery trucks rumbled past, headlights cutting through the pale light of dawn. A bakery opened its doors, letting out the warm scent of fresh bread. A woman jogged past with her dog, nodding politely. None of them knew what had happened just hours ago inside the tower. None of them knew that the quiet janitor walking beside them had once been a decorated officer who carried the weight of battles most could never imagine. And none of them needed to know. Her strength wasn't for show. It wasn't for applause. It was simply who she was. She paused for a moment at a street corner, looking down at her reflection in a puddle on the pavement. The uniform she wore was still the same. The worn-out fabric, the faded name tag, but the woman inside it was no longer invisible. For the first time in years, she didn't look away from her own reflection. She held her own gaze, calm and unshaken. Her voice, steady and low, rose in her mind like a truth she had carried for far too long. Never underestimate the quiet ones. Their silence hides stories you can't imagine. The words echoed, not as a warning, but as a reminder. She thought of her fallen comrades, of the weight of the medals hidden in her apartment, of the nights she had wondered if her life had lost its meaning. And she realized now, meaning wasn't gone. It had only been waiting. As the morning sun crept higher, she kept walking, each step carrying her further from the shadows of her past. She wasn't proud in the way the executives had been proud, flaunting their wealth and status. No, what she felt was something deeper. It was not pride, but relief. Relief that she had not let herself be crushed by cruelty. Relief that she had chosen dignity over silence. Relief that she could still stand tall, even when the world tried to bend her down. Kindness is strength, she thought, but so is knowing when to stand tall. The lesson was as much for her as it was for them. She would continue her work, mopping floors and cleaning halls, but she would never again believe she was less than anyone else. Her strength was not in the job she did, but in the woman she was. The streets brightened, the first rush of workers filling the sidewalks. They hurried past her, barely noticing, as if she was just another face in the morning crowd. And that was fine. She didn't need their recognition. She knew who she was, and that was enough. Appearances deceive. True strength is often hidden, and arrogance always falls. That was the moral of her night, and she carried it with her like armor no one could see. She walked on, not as the janitor they once mocked, but as the soldier she had always been, silent, steady, unshakable. And as the city came alive around her, she disappeared into the crowd, leaving behind only the echo of her lesson, a truth that would linger in the hearts of those who had tried to break her. Respect is earned, not given, and those who mock the quiet often learn too late just how loud silence can be.